Well, I'm happy to be able to introduce our speaker today. I think it's a great privilege for us to have Professor Karl Appuhn of the University of Oregon to talk to us about the sinking city of Venice. And Karl and I go back a fair ways. We've shared a few pizzas and a few ice creams in Venice over the years, and I've always found his research to be very fascinating. In the years since he graduated from Northwestern University in 1999 with an MA and a PhD, where he studied with Professor Ed Muir, he has had the opportunity to work in research at a number of the most prestigious institutions that scholars of Europe, early modern Europe, can work at. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at the American Academy in Rome. He was a Mellon Fellow in the Society of the Humanities at Columbia University. He has been awarded a fellowship from the Gladys Kribel-Delmas Foundation, which is the premier research foundation for Venetian studies. And he is presently working on two works of environmental history, one on the trees of Venice, the forest management of Venice, and the other on the flood control and the phenomenon of the high water at Venice, which is what he will talk to us about today. His topic for today's lecture is Drowning a Renaissance City, the Dilemmas of Flood Control in Venice from the Renaissance to the Present. And I'll turn the time over to him.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to take you on a little tour of Venice today. It's mostly about the Renaissance. There will be a very little bit about the present dilemmas as I get to the end of the talk. I'm going to be talking about something that I like to call the history of mud, because Venice is a city that's built in an aquatic environment, a lagoon, but the principal preoccupation for Venetians for the last really 600 or 700 years has been maintaining an optimal mixture of water and dirt in that lagoon. And that's why I sometimes call this the history of mud. This will come back later in the talk. Less facetiously, the subject of the talk today is arguably one of the most famous environmental problems in the Western world. The seasonal pattern of tidal flooding in Venice known as acqua alta, or high water. I have some very poor images, small images of the city underwater. This is from the November 1966 flood, which is certainly the best known and the worst flood in the history of the city, a flood which actually was the result of two high tides. The first one that got jammed up in the lagoon by factors that I'll talk about in a minute and didn't recede, followed by a second one which resulted in an inundation that hasn't been matched since and hopefully won't be again. But this is only the present-day incarnation of a problem that goes back a number of centuries, as I said, 600 or 700 years. And it is, in fact, a human creation. The problem is a human creation, and it is the result of the deliberate manipulation of the environments, the lagoon environment that the Venetians lived in, manipulation that was aimed at creating this most astonishing artifact of human ingenuity, which is the city of Venice itself. Now, most people are superficially acquainted with this story about how the Venetians modified the lagoon to create the space to build the city. And they're familiar with most of the time, some rather schematic version of this story. Today I'm going to tell you a version of this story, and I'm going to advance a very particular claim. And it is a claim about the way in which this story has been told, or what I'm going to argue is mistold, and therefore misinterpreted. Current versions of the history of flooding in Venice emphasize, or tend to emphasize, how the vicissitudes of the modern world, post-war industrialization of the surrounding mainland, the creation of landfill in the lagoon, which is a problem I'll come back to later, removal of groundwater from the water table under the city, global warming, rising sea levels, and just too many tourists, have all contributed to the dire circumstances that now face the city. I don't mean to suggest that these things do not matter. On the contrary, they matter a great deal if there's still going to be a Venice a century from now. But writing the history this way, that is to say, concentrating on these 20th century post-war vicissitudes that have contributed to the, let's say, worsening of the problem, lead to two crucial misunderstandings, both of which I would suggest increase the risk that Venice might actually disappear. First, the story creates the illusion, and it's an illusion I've already addressed, that the flooding is, while certainly not a new problem, it's a problem that's somehow different in character. That is to say that the problem that Venice has faced since the Second World War is a problem that is brand new and particular to the 20th century. Because, in part, the problem's gotten worse, and in part because it's become a much more regular phenomenon in the last 20 or 30 years. The second misunderstanding, I think, is that the difference, or this difference between the way it floods now and the way it used to flood, if we can put it that way, this difference resides almost exclusively in the many changes associated with the shift in the way Westerners view the exploitation of nature. And this is a shift that goes back to more or less the 17th century or the 18th century, and it's commonly associated with what we now today call the scientific revolution. This notion that humans can modify, alter, tweak, if you will, nature to serve their own ends. And this is an idea that's much more recent than the original modifications to the lagoon. And it's an idea, as I say, that dates back to the 17th century. And what I think in the most famous formulation of it, Carolyn Merchant, who's an environmental philosopher, has called this, in the title of her first book, the death of nature. Sort of this notion that nature becomes this machine that can be altered to suit our needs. And that somehow the way that the story gets told now assumes that the combination of these two things, sort of the vicissitudes of the post-war era combined with this much more recent vision of nature as something that can be altered, something that can be toyed with and modified, are what account for the dilemma that the city faces today. The dilemma is, in fact, as I suggest, much earlier. And so what I'm going to argue instead is that the gravity of the problem is certainly greater than it was 200 years ago. The city floods more often, and the water rises to a much higher level than it did before. But the essential character of the problem has not changed. What has changed is, in fact, the way we think about the problem. The problem itself is still the same problem. It's how we think about it that's changed. And that leads to some consequences. Because the way we think about the problem conditions the kinds of solutions that we are going to adduce to address it. And so that our current understanding is an understanding that's shared by, let's say, local and national authorities, as well as the innumerable well-intentioned foreigners who every year give their time, money, and expertise to solve this problem. So while we may be living in what Merchant calls the post-Cartesian, post-Lockean world of mechanized exploitable nature, that only explains why the problem's worse than it was. It does not explain why the problem's actually proven so intractable, why it is that despite every effort to resolve this problem for now going on about 600 years, it persists. To understand why, despite the money and knowledge that's been deployed to save Venice, things only seem to be getting worse. The only way we're going to understand that is to look at the historical dimensions of the problem. And what I'm going to talk about today is one particular historical dimension of the problem. I'm going to talk about how the pre-modern approach, let's say before 1800, to the problem of flooding in the lagoon was conceptualized in two ways. One, in terms, and these are both ways in which we do not conceptualize it today. The first is this problem of mud, as I said, so that the pre-modern Venetians tended to conceive of the problem as a problem of striking what they would call a useful balance between tidal flux, that is to say the amount of water that enters the lagoon from the sea, and sedimentary accumulation, the amount of dirt that settles in the lagoon, and that dirt has two primary sources. One is its alluvial sediment that's brought downstream by a series of of rivers that I'll show you in a second, and then either empties directly into the lagoon or is pushed back into the lagoon by the tide. That's the first. And the second is they conceived of this problem in terms of making the lagoon, not altering the lagoon, even though they were altering the lagoon, and they're I wouldn't say hypocritical about this, but they have a very fraught relationship to the problem of modifying the lagoon. But the way in which they framed engineering projects to modify the lagoon was not in terms of altering it, of changing it, but in terms of preserving it so that it could be the best lagoon that it possibly can be. And I'll come back to this as well in a minute. This state of the lagoon, the best lagoon it could be, as well as this state of balance between the accumulation of sediment and tidal flux, these balances are dictated by what the Venetians perceived to be natural, or the state of natura, as they called it. By contrast, the way in which we conceive of the problem, the current conceptualizations of the problem, stress two factors: restoration of the city and its monuments, and preservation of the city. So we have to fix the city and its monuments, and then we have to preserve them from further decay. And in a sense, that's an inversion of the way in which the problem was set up by the Venetians when they originally created or altered the lagoon to serve their needs. They stressed preserving the lagoon, and the city was, in a sense, a secondary consideration, or at least the city emerged from, the greatness of the city emerged from the efforts to preserve the lagoon. Today we think of it in terms of preserving the city, and let's worry about what happens to the lagoon later. And that's something that I'll come back to also at the end of the talk. However effective this way of conceiving of the problem, of conceiving of it in terms of a restoration and historic preservation and restoration problem may be at mobilizing foreign capital for art and architectural restoration, it also tends to limit the range of potential responses to the problem in ways that are, at the very least, I'd say, counterproductive. So I'm going to make a claim that most late 20th century historians tend to shy away from. And this claim is that the past really does have lessons for the future. If only to paraphrase a Renaissance thinker, famous Renaissance thinker, Machiavelli, we can learn to taste those lessons and not merely chew on them. Now, as Eric mentioned, I've been working on the environmental history of Venice from two angles. This work on the lagoon is more recent. My original research focused on forest management and the basic question, how individuals, groups, and institutions have created and maintained the environmental knowledge necessary to implement programs of resource management, or in my particular case, forest management. And I'm going to talk about that very, very briefly to illustrate how it is that I became interested in the problem of lagoon management and how it is that I came to think about it in the way that I'm explaining today. When I was working on forest management, I was examining the ways in which different groups within the Venetian Republic possessed very different understandings of what was out there on the mainland, how many forests there were, what kinds of forests, what they looked like, where you could get the trees that you needed for urban construction, for naval construction, and so on. And I was interested in parsing out how these different institutions thought about this problem. And superficially, the problem of lagoon management looked exactly the same, and so I wasn't initially very, very interested in it. I thought, well, I've already done that. I've already worked that out for the forests, how different institutions think about the problem. And I was only interested in the problem of lagoon management because it was, maintaining the lagoon was one of the major drains on the forest reserves. They had to build, as you'll see in a minute, these massive breakwater systems to limit the influx of the tide into the lagoon. And I was mostly interested in how many trees they cut down to build these breakwaters. And as you'll see, it's actually a phenomenal number. And so I was interested in that, and as I began to read about that debate, about that consumption, I began to realize that, in fact, I hadn't seen, it wasn't a different iteration of the same problem. Venetian bureaucrats disagreed often violently about forest management. What was the best way to manage forests, which trees ought to be cut down, which ones ought to be saved. There were no such disagreements about lagoon management. by and large, the Venetian state spoke with a single voice on the subject of lagoon management. So while these debates over forest management showed irreconcilable differences between the ways legislators and expert managers and engineers conceived of the environment and creating a scheme for manipulating it, debates over lagoon management revealed no such schisms or fault lines. The legislators and the elected officials charged with overseeing the lagoon rarely, if ever, differed on anything. The engineers who oversaw the maintenance of the lagoon infrastructure, they recommended courses of action that were almost invariably approved. There wasn't a lot of bureaucratic hassle, if we want to think about it in modern terms. The sheer number of decisions, proposals, and policies produced by the Renaissance state attest to the fact that lagoon management was a major concern. They're always talking about it. The Venetian Senate, they're always concerned about the problem of flooding. They're concerned also about the problem of sedimentary accumulation because they want to keep the port open, but they never argue about it. What's absent is debate. There's no serious disagreement over what should be done. There are some dissenting opinions, but these, by and large, come from foreigners or from, as we'll see, experts who are trained overseas and returned to Venice. Foreigners who came to Venice trying to sell the Venetian Senate on a particular scheme of lagoon management. The most famous of these, and it's one I'm only going to mention very briefly today, is a 16th century Paduan, Alvise Cornaro, who came and proposed, among other things, that they ought to seal the lagoon off from the sea. And he offered 3 or 4 different versions of this. In his most extreme version, it was to drain it altogether. My favorite one was to make a sort of swimming pool around the city so that the city would still be on water, but the lagoon itself could be turned over to agriculture, to growing wheat, which Cornaro saw as basically a far more profitable use for that space than as swamp, or brackish water, which is essentially what it was. I'll mention him very briefly. I'll talk in some more detail about a different character who comes at the end of the 17th century in the 1690s and offers another radical solution. And that was how I initially got interested in this project, but I let it drop because I thought, well, wasn't what I was concerned about. I was interested in debate, I was interested in disagreement, and I said, well, there's no disagreement here. And so I set it aside. And I started working on a completely different project, which I'm going to briefly describe to you now, which is our tour of Venice. And that was, I was interested in the history of tourism. And the history of tourism brought me back to this problem of lagoon management in a very roundabout way. The history of tourism in Venice, it was an obvious topic. Venice is, after all, one of the oldest tourist attractions certainly in the Western world. And it's also one of the tourist attractions in the Western world that's the easiest to get lost in, if you want to think about it this way. It's very difficult to find your way around Venice. And so this was how I began to attack the problem initially. I was wondering whether there was some way to figure out how pre-modern tourists who came to visit the city and see its sights and see its wonders, how did they deal with the problem that modern tourists deal with all the time? You see them around the city puzzling over maps all the time, which is how do you find your way around what is objectively a complicated system of streets? And this in an era before there were accurate projection plats that would allow you to have your rough guide or your streetwise Venice map to fold out and say, okay, there I am. So I began by reading pilgrimage narratives and other visitors' accounts of the city, and I was hoping to find out how they negotiated the topography of the city. What I found is that very much like modern tourists, they all had a list of places that they wanted to go. Also like modern tourists, they moved in groups. Unlike modern tourists, they didn't move by foot. Almost all of their movements from place to place were by boat. This isn't a surprising fact. There were only 55 bridges, and this actually is very important, in the city in the 15th and 16th century, and this is a little map of them. And what you can actually see, one way of thinking about the topography of Venice is that it's a series of small islands. And you can actually see that some of these islands were completely isolated, that there was no permanent bridge joining that island to another island. And so it was actually virtually impossible to move around the city by foot in the 15th and 16th century. It was very, very difficult. Most of these 55 bridges were temporary. They were made of wood. Sometimes they were torn down. Sometimes they were literally just boats that were placed and with planks placed across them so that people could come during certain parts of the day and cross, and then the people who owned the boats would collect a fee, and then they would go home at night. Today, and let's go to our Streetwise map, there are over 300 bridges in Venice, and most of them are permanent, and they're made of stone or metal. So in this world, walking was difficult, if not impossible. In this world, walking is the sensible way to get around. So the answer is that they didn't walk, and they didn't need to worry about finding their way from place to place because they were shuttled on boats, and presumably the people who were rowing the boats knew their way around, and the tourists didn't have to worry about it. They wanted to see San Marco. They wanted to go see the cathedral, which was out in Castello. They wanted to see San Giovanni e Paolo. They would get in the boat. The boatman would take them there for a fee. This is more than just a logistical problem. If you move around the city by boat versus moving around it by foot, it leads to a very different understanding of what the space of the city is like, and it leads to a very different way of conceiving the problem of water in the city. If you move around by boat, water is your principal concern. If you move around by foot, as 95% of Venetians do, except in a recreational way today, and all the tourists except when they're on public transport, you tend to think of it as a terrestrial city with some interesting properties. It's a city that you walk around that happens to have a lot of water in it, rather than a city that's built on water. I had some practical experience with this. So in the time that I lived in Venice, I spent a lot of time rowing around the city in a recreational fashion, as many Venetians do. And so I'd been thinking a lot about how when you row around, you think, oh, it's very, very different. Your understanding of how to get from here to there is very different from when you're walking. Now, looking at pilgrimage narratives and other such sources, I had some historical data, but what did it mean? And I'll give you one example of what it means. I had a conversation in 1996 with the late Gaetano Cozzi. Cozzi is probably the most eminent historian of Venice in the 20th century. He's not from Venice, but he lived most of his life in Venice. He's from a nearby town on the mainland. And in this conversation, we were sitting in Cozzi's apartment, and Cozzi savaged, to not put too fine a point on it, a book by an American historian named Robert Davis. The book talked about the most popular spectator sport in Renaissance Venice, the large public brawls known as guerre dei pugni, or wars of the fists, even though they sometimes use sticks to beat each other over the head. These were very popular spectator events. They drew thousands of spectators to watch them, and Cozzi's apartment was actually overlooked one of the two bridges where most of these battles happened. And he was pointing down at the bridge, and he said to me, that Robert Davis, he didn't understand anything. He didn't understand what these things were about. And the problem that Cozzi had with Davis's book, this is a map from Davis's book, and it shows what Davis argued was the division of the city into two sectors. And the two teams, essentially, that fought on these bridges came from this side of the dotted line or that side of the dotted line. And Cozzi said he didn't know what he was talking about. That's not how the city's divided. That's not what the city looks like. Well, it's true. If you walk around the city, that's not what it looks like, because to get from here to here today, you have to walk all the way over to Accademia, cross a bridge, and then go through the whole Sestiere of San Marco to come out at St. Mark's on the other side. In a world where there are only 55 bridges and most of you are traveling around by boat, it's a quick jump. And this area of the city is much closer to here than this area, whereas now we think of them as equidistant because we walk. And so I would argue, actually, that Cozzi wrote a very unflattering review of Davis's book, as did a lot of other Italians, who said, look, this is a foreigner, he doesn't understand the city at all, that's not how it was structured. I would argue that these bad reviews are due to an anachronism in their thinking, not in Davis's thinking. It's an anachronism that has to do with how they move around the city today, and so they tend to think about these two things as being far apart rather than close together. If you move around by boat, Davis's division, as I say, makes perfect sense. One of the other things to note about moving in the city is that the canal network tends to move in this direction. And that's why you have these parts, the city is divided in this way between these two factions because that's the direction in which you move. You don't move as you do today, either by foot or go out and take a water bus or a water taxi that'll take you down the Canal Grande. So it would appear that Davis was actually right, despite the fact that he wasn't a Venetian. And if the difference between the means of locomotion in the Renaissance and the modern area could lead several of the most eminent Venetian historians, most of them natives of the city, to a misinterpretation of this magnitude, I wondered what other assumptions have historians made based on simple anachronisms of the sort that fooled the critics of Davis's book. And I started to think this problem of lagoon management, of water management, is one of these problems. That because we walk around the city, because we think of it as a terrestrial city with interesting properties rather than a city that we travel around by water, that would lead us into, potentially lead us at least into a series of misinterpretations about the problem itself. So I went ahead with this and I tried to assemble some more coherent evidence about the differences between how modern people think of the city and how early modern people thought of the city. It's a process that geographers like to call cognitive mapping. And what I did is I created 4 categories, essentially, for how you find your way around the city, how not to get lost in Venice. These are the 4 categories. And what you have, essentially, is the Renaissance resident and the modern resident, the Renaissance tourist and the modern tourist. And if you look in chronicles and you look in descriptions, pre-modern descriptions of moving around the city, or you look in the Rough Guide or any number of other modern tourist guides, it will tell you that to find your way around Venice in the pre-modern world, you had to ask about the landmark and the nearest canal, because that's where the guy who was rowing the boat was going to take you. The modern tourist thinks about it in terms of the sestiere, which is this artificial, not entirely artificial, division of the city into 6 sectors. It's a traditional division, but it's not a division that people in the Renaissance thought too much about, except in determined moments, ceremonial moments. And then the landmark, and then the calle, the street, because you're going to walk there. You're not going to go there by boat. The Renaissance resident tended to think of it in terms of parish, because all of those small islands that grew together to form the city were actually separate parishes, and that were then sort of assembled into a larger whole that doesn't correspond to a grid or any other kind of intuitive organization. But if you know the map of the city, and modern residents still think about it this way, if you ask someone where they live, they'll tell you what parish their apartment is in, and then they'll tell you how to get there from the central landmark in the parish, but usually by street. Instead, in the Renaissance, it's very similar. You'll have your parish, you'll have your landmark, then you'll have something called an island, and it's not what you're thinking. An island is actually a series of contiguous buildings that are associated usually with some noble family. And it's a cognitive category that early modern Europeans quite commonly used in almost every city in Europe. They'll talk about the island of, the Contarini or the Barbari in the parish of Santa Fosca or whatever it is, and then Canal. And so you can see that the way in which people conceive of the problem is very, very different. When does the switch happen? When does this go to this? In most European cities, it happens sometime in the 17th century, because that's when street plats start to be used in cities like Marseille, Paris, and Rome, and so on. In Venice, it happens much later, because it's very difficult to have a street plat of Venice, and it happens actually in the 19th century. So that now the city is organized according to this very strange street plat, in which the addresses are organized by sestiere, one of these 6 areas in the city, and they go consecutively from one to the first door in the sestiere all the way to the last one, and they make no reference to what we would commonly associate with features on a plat, like street names and so on. And only the people who deliver the mail really understand the address system in the city. But that's a 19th century fiction or creation that was used for administrative purposes. So in Venice, because of its peculiar topography, it's a very late development. And it reveals, as I say, in a kind of vivid way, how the way we think of the city has changed since the Renaissance. The other thing is, if you look I sat when I was in Rome at the American Academy, I read a lot of 19th century tourist guides hundreds of them, to Venice. And you can actually see that when it is that tourists stop using the boat to get around, and it's only about 100 years ago. So this modern tourist vision of the city, this pedestrian city, is also extraordinarily recent compared to other cities in Europe. So now I had this model, and I was interested in looking at different consequences of it. And so the first issue that I tried to apply it to was to this issue of flooding in the city, because the behavior of water is central to the operation of the city. And it's not just a nuisance. The city actually depends upon the influx of the tide. Not only does it affect the access of to the sea, the Renaissance Venetians had this motto, or this kind of maxim, said, big lagoon equals a big port. So the more tidal flux you could get into the lagoon, the more sediment it was going to carry out to sea with it, and so the deeper the port was going to remain. It was going to remain accessible to vessels, and Venice's only or principal source, let's say, not only, but principal source of income in the pre-modern world was maritime trade, at least into the 16th century, and it starts to shift. The other very practical purpose that the tide serves is it carries the city's waste products out of the lagoon, and that's still true today. Almost every building in Venice is an open discharge, and I'll let you think about that. So I started to think about that question that I had dismissed before, that question of why it is that Venetians didn't argue about flooding. Why is it that there was no violent disagreement about how to manage the lagoon when they disagreed about forest management, they disagreed about the agricultural policy, they disagreed about all of these other what we would call basically environmental management problems, except one. Why is it? Well, the answer is quite simple. They shared a common understanding of what the lagoon was, what it meant, and what kind of space it was. And it was a common understanding that was based on the fact that they all moved around it in the same way. This is something that the sociologist Melvin Palmer calls mundane region. I'll give you one very, very simple explanation of this. When the Venetians expanded onto the mainland in the 15th century, in the 1440s, they were having firewood shortages in the lagoon, so they sent an administrator out to find firewood in the nearby mainland. So he goes out there, and he comes back, and he presents a 75-page report on firewood resources to the Venetian Senate. About 2 pages talk about trees. He says, well, today we saw a lot of places full of trees, because he'd never seen a tree before. And he spends 73 pages talking about the network of irrigation canals and how you can take a boat and go from here and turn left and go up this canal and turn right, and how this one's filled in and this one needs to be dredged out. He was supposed to be looking at forests, but all he saw was water. These are people who are conditioned, because of the way in which they move around the lagoon, to think about water first and land second. We are now conditioned to think about land first and water second. And it's this very simple inversion. It also explains why all of the kind of radical proposals about lagoon management, some of which I'll talk about in a minute, came from foreigners, because only foreigners thought about the city in any terms other than the lagoon and the water that we move around with is what we need to preserve. But the lagoon was more than just a kind of peculiar environment. It was more than something that you needed a boat to move around with. It was, to use the word of Bernardo Trevisan, an 18th century engineer Venetian engineer who wrote a treatise on lagoon management, a delicate machine. While the machine metaphor might have been of recent vintage in 1715, the basic idea was not. The lagoon was and is an engineered environment. It was shaped by human hands to meet changing human needs. It wasn't always this way. When humans first settled in the area, the lagoon was a brackish freshwater body with relatively minimal tidal variance. It was a delta marsh. Here they are cleaning the refuse out of the canals that wasn't carried out by the tides. I'll show you a series of slides that show you how Venice developed. There were, in fact, several of these lagoons. All of this striped area was area that were lagoons very much like Venice's. All of these have disappeared. Those were, in antiquity, referred to as the seven seas, from whence the expression to sail the seven seas comes from. they had been swallowed up by alluvial sediment. And the Venetians were witnessing this, and they were determined that it wasn't going to happen to their lagoon. They wanted to keep it a lagoon. And so they did this in a number of different ways. And the most dramatic way in which they did it was by deviating the three rivers that originally emptied into the lagoon. The Brenta, for which they laid a new bed that went south and out of the lagoon, and the Piave, which they deviated to the north, and also the Sile, which they also gave a new cut to minimize the amount of fresh water and the amount of alluvial sediment that came into the lagoon, to keep it a lagoon. Or in the words of a 1413 author who was involved in, an anonymous author who was involved in some of the initial debates about these modifications, he said, "It is our obligation," and it was the Venetians' obligation, to, quote, "preserve the lagoon as nature intended, as provident nature intended." And so the idea was to keep it a lagoon, to keep it what they perceived of as natural, to keep it from being swallowed up by the earth. And they did this. The other more mundane way in which they did it is they dug up sediment. They literally dredged it up from the lagoon floor, and they made landfill out of it. So that originally Venice was a collection of widely dispersed islands, which they brought together through this process of dredging up alluvial sediment and building new landfill on which to build, until by the 15th century or the late 14th century you get more or less the city that we see today. There's Venice, sometimes they say, looks like a fish. There's the tail, there's the head. So today there's a little bit extra here on the tail, and there's some more here on the head, and they've added a couple of islands out here. But by and large, this is, by the beginning of the 15th century, you've got the city that we see today. And it was this kind of laborious process. The second thing they do, as I said, are these river deviations. This is a satellite photograph, and you can actually see the Brenta cut, rivers in nature. And this is where they're a little bit, they have a bit of a problem with this rhetoric about keeping it natural, because, of course, rivers in nature don't make these kinds of hard right turns. But you can actually see where now the Brenta discharges. And the Sile and the Sile cut is this hard cut here, and then there's the Piave cut. This worked more or less the way in which they wanted it to work. And there's been a tremendous amount of paper produced on this problem, most of it by a French historian named Elisabeth Cruzet-Perrin. The problem is that when they write the story of this, they stop in 1500, because in 1500 the Venetians have won. They have stopped the accumulation or slowed the accumulation of alluvial sediment in the lagoon to the point at which it's manageable by increasing the influx of tide, by decreasing the influx of fresh water. The problem is that in the 16th century they started to experience some new difficulties that they hadn't anticipated. One is flooding, which becomes a regular phenomenon for the first time in the 16th century. And the other one is, very simply, that they hadn't calculated on, is that, of course, these rivers dump the sediment out into the Adriatic, where it stays in suspension for a certain period of time. When you increase the amount of water that comes in with each tidal cycle, what does it bring with it? More alluvial sediment. So in the long run, the sediment problem comes back, but it comes back from the other side. So in the 16th century, they start a new process, and this new process is they start to build a series of breakwaters and levees along these barrier islands. They had some smaller breakwaters to protect the main entrances to the port. There's the city. But in the 16th century, they start to build breakwaters on a really massive scale. And the breakwaters are intended to channel the influx of salt water and make it work, in a sense, more efficiently for the city. This part of the project turns out to be much less of a success. So if you stop it as Cruzet-Perrin does in 1500, it looks like the Venetians come up with this really ingenious system. If you work past 1500, you can actually see that they create a series of problems that they hadn't anticipated. I'll say very briefly about the tidal action. It wasn't random, and it wasn't completely controllable. So they tinker with this system over and over again, because, in fact, because it used to be a delta marsh, the floor of the lagoon is crisscrossed by these deep by deeper and less deep channels that are residues of the old river systems that used to flood through there. So when the flood comes in, when the flood tide comes in, of course, water moves very quickly up these channels and less quickly up the shallow portions of the lagoon, and it tends to dump the sediment or deposit the sediment that it carries into these large mudflats. These large mudflats were and are important to the economy of the city. They provide habitat for shellfish, for birds, for other fauna. Most of the shellfish that you eat in Venice is fished in and around the lagoon. If you go to Venice, you might want to think about that before you order your plate of spaghetti alle vongole or some other shellfish dish. Because, of course, there's a lot of industrial discharge in the lagoon today as well. But they quickly began to learn that that they could manipulate the journey of the tide in and out of the lagoon by deepening some channels and filling in others. But striking that perfect balance was, they recognized, an unattainable goal. So they understood that they needed to create a balance between tidal action so that the tides came up high but not too high, so that they didn't flood the city, but they carried the waste products out to sea, and they carried some sediment with them. And they needed to diminish the freshwater flow into the lagoon so that it would minimize the amount of alluvial sediment. But they also understood that there was no way that they were ever going to get it just right. So this was a constant process. It required constant tinkering. Most of the tinkering involved this area here in front of St. Mark's. This is a view of the city from the famous Barbary map, where most of the ships anchored. And then there were two channels that the ships used to get from there. One was out here at San Nicolò, and the other was at Malamocco, and they were interested in keeping those clear. We can actually figure out how difficult it was for them. So in the 17th century, in the period where they were fighting the Ottomans for possession of Crete, 1645 to 1668, they were building bigger warships to fight this war, and they couldn't get them from the arsenal where they were built out to sea because this canal had been filled in with alluvial sediment to the point that the ships couldn't float through. So they had to do a number of different things, like lift them up with barges and assemble the top deck of the ship out here. So you can actually see that the flooding is bringing sediment and is causing problems. The other thing that would happen is that often when the tide got high enough, it would wash over these barrier islands and dump more dirt into the lagoon. And there's also in chronicles and so on, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. People will mention floods and say, well, the city flooded today. And you can see that these mentions become more frequent as the 16th and 17th century goes on. Now I'll give you some very concrete evidence of this. Going ahead. This comes from these are statistics on timber consumption. And this shows you how many thousands of oak poles, trunks, were driven into that breakwater system. And as you can see, the trend is ever increasing. So that in the early and mid-16th century, they have some years where sporadically they have to replace piles because they've been washed away by storm and tide. But by and large, there are also years where they're not using them at all. By the beginning of the 17th century, it's becoming a much more regular occurrence. By the end of the 17th century, you can see that some years they're putting as many as 30,000, and in 1692, 40,000 new piles into this breakwater system designed to keep the tide from washing over the barrier islands and designed to channel the force of the tide and keep the lagoon clear. This is enormously expensive. It's an enormous undertaking because these piles have to be driven by hand, because the dirt has to be moved by hand. This is before the era of steam power. And you might wonder, what do they make of it? Do they see this as a new problem? Do they see this as a change? Do they see this as a moment at which they have to start protecting themselves against the sea in the same way as they used to try to protect themselves against water? The answer is no. They persist with the same basic goal, that goal of striking the balance between water and sediment in the lagoon. They see this as an inconvenience, but they don't see it as an insurmountable problem. They have debates over the design of these breakwaters, and eventually they decide in the 1720s that they're going to build them out of stone, which is why that data series peters out after 1720, because they start to replace them wholesale with stone. Here's one debate. This is from 1692. It coincides with that flood that took away 40,000 oak piles, and this illustrates in a way, I think, quite succinctly the difference between the way the Venetians thought of the problem and the way others thought of the problem. In 1692, a Venetian, or at least a Venetian-born engineer by the name of Matteo Alberti, but he hadn't lived in Venice in about 20 years. He had gone overseas to Holland, where he had been trained in Dutch land reclamation techniques. He comes back to Venice in 1692, and he says to the Senate, look, you're doing this all wrong. The breakwaters that you're building are all wrong. Your approach to controlling the floods is all wrong. What you need to do is you need to do what the Dutch have done. And he's a different iteration of the old 16th century Cornaro who wanted to turn Venice into a swimming pool. You have to seal the lagoon off, and you have to do it using this Dutch technology. So this is a Venetian breakwater, and as I'll show you in a second, it looks remarkably like the ones that are still there. And this is a Dutch breakwater, and this is actually Matteo Alberti's technical design. There's his signature down there, Matteo Alberti Ingegnere. And he tells the Senate, he says, not only is this a better way because you're just simply going to be flooded into oblivion in the long run, he says, but it's cheaper too, and I can prove it to you. And he has all of these cost estimates. What ensues is actually some senators say, well, okay, why don't you build a section of breakwater your way, and we'll see if it is in fact cheaper, more efficient, and more durable. So they give him a section of breakwater to play with. And he builds one of these breakwaters here with a vertical wall. It's a total disaster. It turns out to be more expensive, and it fails immediately. That same winter, it's completely washed away. Alberti, in the tradition of all good engineers and construction contractors, he cries foul. And he says, well, the materials weren't delivered on time, and they weren't the right materials, and I didn't want that. I wanted them over here. And besides, the section of breakwater that you gave me was the worst possible section, and if you want to give me a fair trial, you should have given me one over there. The Venetian expert who was in charge of the breakwaters, a man named Karl Appuhn, he's very calm about this. He says, well, all of that may in fact be true, he says. But what Alberti is ignoring is that his system is going to result in the shrinkage of the lagoon. It's going to make the lagoon smaller than it was before. It's going to isolate Venice from the sea. And we all know, says Guberni, that grande laguna fa grande porto. The big lagoon makes the big port, as nature intended. And so Guberni says, look, this is what nature intended. This is not. This is Northern European mechanistic thinking. And then he actually has also a completely reliable and accurate description of why it is that this structure fails. He says, look, the problem isn't whether you have a sloping front or a straight front. The problem is that the wave action comes in from the side and it erodes away the base of the breakwater. And this breakwater has a lot more base to erode away, so it's going to last a lot longer. This one, as soon as this gets eroded away, the whole thing's going to fail. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The fate of Alberti's proposal is telling. The Venetians were concerned about cost, and as I say, Alberti claimed that he had the cost estimates to prove that his system was cheaper and more efficient. In 1692, they were on the eve of their last major war against the Ottomans. Money was a big issue. But Guberni said it best. It violates the logic of nature's workings. It violates the maxim of large lagoon makes large port. And this was an opinion that was echoed by the senators and the members of the Council of Ten who heard Alberti's pleas for a second try. Because the Venetian vision was one where the two elements had to mix. The foreign vision, this Dutch vision, was one where you isolate the city from the sea. That, by the way, is the way in which we conceive of the problem. And so this bears some reflection, and I'm going to show you two images now. This is the modern breakwater. This is from a 1705 treatise, or 1715 treatise. It's the one I quoted from earlier. And it shows the Venetian view, perfectly well. You have opponesi elemento ad elemento, right? Element against element opposed. You have, trust me on this, male sea and female land, female earth, locked in what is not quite a struggle, not quite a lover's embrace, but eternal, ongoing, perpetual. And then in the background, there's Venice, the two columns in the Piazzetta, and Venice is the beneficiary. So long as you can keep the two elements struggling against one another and keep one from winning out over the other, then you have a great city. So the great city emerges from the great lagoon, not the other way around. Now, with apologies, because the author is in the audience, and I mean this with great respect, contrast this with a recent book. So this is the modern conception. It's Venice against the sea. And it's a nice cover, and you can see it sort of the illusion. Venice is sinking, the sea is besieging. And it's a city besieged. This is the pre-modern way of thinking about the problem. This is the modern way of thinking about the problem. And it comes directly out of this experience, this everyday mundane experience of walking around the city versus traveling around the lagoon and the city by boat. So two questions emerge. And one is, when did the switch away from the Renaissance view occur? So when did we go from this to this? And why is this necessarily a better way of looking at it than this? Because it's not, obviously. As I said before, the shift occurs at the beginning of the 19th century, and that's when a number of factors converged to alter dramatically the way the Venetians understood the city. Throughout the 18th century, the Venetian Republic had been working to make the city easier to traverse on foot. Streets were paved, because in the 16th century, only one street per parish was paved. Most of them were dirt. A few stone bridges were built to connect some of the more difficult-to-reach parishes with the rest of the city, and poor Venetians no longer moved primarily by boat, although water remained the principal route for upper-class Venetians and middle-class Venetians. You only have to think of, in 18th century terms, about Casanova, who spends a good deal of his voluminous diaries praising his great gondola and his great gondolier. When Napoleon conquered the city in May of 1797, he accelerated these programs, both because he had an interest in urban planning and because he wanted to be able to move troops easily from place to place. When Napoleon handed the city over to the Austrians the following year, it was irrevocably altered. Most people walked. Far fewer people traveled by boat. For their part, the Austrians thought about it as we think about it, as a terrestrial city with a few interesting properties. They had no idea about the sort of long-term history of the problem of lagoon management. They wanted one thing. They wanted a blue water port, and they set about to create it. They dredged deeper channels to let deeper draft ships into the lagoon. That increased the speed and the rate, principally, at which water enters the lagoon with each tidal cycle. So the deeper those channels are, the higher the tide's going to rise. The shallower those channels are, so the Venetians were very self-conscious about keeping them fairly shallow, not too shallow, but fairly shallow. The less the tide's going to rise. So today, when the tide starts rising outside of the barrier islands, about 5 minutes pass between when the tide starts rising there and when it starts rising in front of San Marco. In the 16th century, it was more about 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes. That's the difference. It's these deep water channels. There were numerous other consequences to the Austrian vision of it as a terrestrial city with interesting properties, but the most dramatic is this flooding problem. In the 20th century, the Italian states kind of made it worse. They dug a new deep water channel to let oil tankers into to feed the refineries built at Porto Marghera, and of course cruise ships to discharge paying customers into the city. And this is part of the problem, which is that the city is caught because most Venetians would like to see the lagoon altered in a way, in a sense, restored to this state, the state in which sort of the early modern Venetians conceived of it. But on the other hand, they also want the tourist dollar because it's the only viable economic activity that's left in the city. It's also parenthetically the demographically oldest city in Europe, and so the city's becoming more and more depopulated with each passing year. And so there are fewer people around to sort of protest. But the going back to the very beginning, it's true that the 20th century is something different happened in the 20th century, or the 19th and the 20th century, but it has to do with the way we think of it. And so without the governing principle that had guided the Renaissance Republic, keeping water and dirt in permanent opposition, the sea was allowed to become besieging element, and the very existence of the city is now at risk. But, and now I'll finish, by framing the question in terms of historic preservation, preserving buildings, preserving the city, the Italian state and groups of concerned foreigners are only going to make things worse in the long run. The best proposal that's been, or the proposal that's sort of won in these debates, is these mobile seawalls, known as Mosè or Moses, that would be raised in the event of an acqua alta, because the acqua alta phenomenon is absolutely predictable. It is a result of seasonal and climatic characteristics. The 16th century Venetians understood exactly why and when acqua alta was going to happen. And these things now are quite predictable. Sirens go off well in advance. And they would know when to raise these gates and seal the lagoon off, just like Alvise Cornaro and Matteo Alberti would have liked. Seal it off from the sea, make it a swimming pool, right? And that keeps the tide out, and it keeps the city from being damaged by these incredibly damaging and expensive floods. But it's based on this false premise, this modern premise, that the lagoon is basically in a stable state, except for the flooding. It's a solution that would have been unrecognizable to the people that made the lagoon the way it is. So I would suggest that the lesson, if there is a lesson here being offered for us to taste from history, is that if the goal is to preserve what is still sort of, it's one of the most fantastic cities in the world, and certainly in Europe, don't employ half-hearted overpriced solutions based on these kind of false modern conceptions. Take a lesson from, well, it's only 400 miles from here, the world's greatest tourist trap, and preserve it. This is not Venice, Venice. This is Las Vegas, Venice. Because the people that used this scheme were ultimately quite pragmatic about it. They knew that they weren't ever going to get it quite right, and they knew that they had to play with it, constantly play with it, and that they were always open to playing with it in different ways. The lagoon, they understood, was designed to imitate nature, but also to serve ever-changing human needs. So I think Guberni, who was Alberti's big opponent, I think he would prefer this to this. And I doubt he'd probably be too scandalized by the suggestion. And that's my say. Thank you very much. Take your book out. He's just behind you. It's John, and I apologize. I don't know how to say your last name. Cahey, right? I recognize you from the jacket photo, but I'd be glad to take some questions or. Who were the foreign visitors in early modern Venice? It does change over time. The consistent group, two consistent groups are pilgrims who stop in Venice. It's a typical way station on the way to the Holy Land. And it's actually a common embarkation point. That starts to tail off as the kind of Mediterranean becomes more divided later on, but that's a consistent group, certainly in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. The other most common group are foreign, and also people who are on the pilgrimage to Rome would often stop in Venice to see if they could afford to do so. The other group, and the group that leaves the most, let's say the largest number of records behind, are foreign dignitaries who were there on business. And they were actually, I guess one way to think about it is they were, one of the things that the foreign dignitaries really wanted to visit in the 16th century were these breakwaters. This was a well-known kind of wonder of Venice. And you can even see it once they start building them in the early 16th century in Marino Sanuto's diaries. Almost, I'd say probably 2 in 10 foreign dignitaries who come to Venice, Sanuto says, want to see the breakwaters. And part of the reason is they tend to come up, they come down the Po River, and then they're brought to Chioggia, and they're berthed overnight in Chioggia, and then they're rowed up to the city to go to the ducal palace, and they always asked to stop on the way to visit these. So those are the two principal groups. Then in the 19th century, or well, the 18th century, in the 17th, 18th century, you get this new kind of tourism, the Grand Tour tourism. And it's Northern Europeans, most typically English or French, who come, and they leave behind a different kind of travel log in which they talk about the pleasures of Venice and its sinfulness and the courtesans and these kinds of things. But what you see is all the way through the 19th century, they remark on the flooding, and often they'll go in the fall because they know that that's when it floods. But they'll always talk about these Grand Tour travel logs, always talk about what a happy event the flooding is, that everybody comes out, takes the day off, splashes around, and it's great fun. And that lasts up until more or less the war. And then it's interrupted by the war. And then after the war, it suddenly takes on this other valence. So.
To what extent do visitors, are they sensitive to this local cognitive mapping that you were talking about earlier? Do they pick up on it? Do they bring their own preconceptions to the way that you negotiate city space?
Oh, they definitely bring their own preconceptions. And that is they're always trying to negotiate it with the streetwise map, and they always get turned around. And it depends. If you spend a lot of time there, I think as Eric can attest, you get better and better and more efficient. But what happens is you start living there and you develop like 2 or 3 routes that you know, and you start wearing the stones down on those routes, and then eventually you kind of expand outward. But it is still, I mean, there's still, I would say, for example, I don't know where the map of the city is, but there's still today, like, they're almost all dying now, but women and men in their 90s, let's say, who are close to centenarians, who live, let's say, at the tail of the fish, who've only been to St. Mark's maybe 4 or 5 times in their entire life. They just don't leave their neighborhoods. But that of course has changed now completely. So those people, in 10 years, they'll all be gone. But people try to negotiate it. So the classic story I always tell is the one where, I'm 150 meters away from St. Mark's, and there's this American couple, and they're standing on this bridge, and they're arguing, A, about what direction they need to turn the map to figure out where they are, and whether or not, which way St. Mark's is. And I stop, and I tell them, I say, it's that way. And they look at me, and they say, no, it's not. And I say, no, trust me, it is. Just walk straight that way for 150 meters, and you'll find it. And they say, no. Absolutely not. And they go back to their map, and I say, okay, forget about it, and I just walk on. Well, it's the shift from what you see in other cities, and here I can go back. Oh, and can I just add one other? Is on the Streetwise map, how do you negotiate the city? You follow the yellow brick road. You can see it. It's marked out for you. That way you don't risk getting lost in these other areas. So it's the shift from these, wait, there it is. So if you look at this and you go to any European city in the 15th century, everybody gets around this way except for that. You just substitute street for canal. But most people in the 15th century, in most European cities, they don't think of it in terms of street names or street directions. They think of it in terms of parish, landmark. Yes. What family is associated with that particular area. And then the other distinction that you sometimes see are craft-based distinctions. So where are the leather workers, or where are the gold workers? And so people know that. So if you say to somebody, well, you go to the neighborhood of the, I don't know, the Sforza or something like that in Milan, then you know where that is, and then you can find your way. And you see this in, the source where you see this is in notarial and property transactions. So when a notary records a property transaction in almost any European city in the 15th century, they record it with some combination of these. They don't have street names and they don't have addresses. In the 16th and going into the 17th century, in all of the terrestrial cities in Europe, it doesn't happen at exactly the same time. It happens at different times at different places. City governments, municipal governments, and sometimes states start to impose a street plat system. And they do it for 2 reasons. One, so that there's a universal language that all notaries can use and everybody can understand. Because if a notary sells a piece of property, records the transaction of a piece of property between two people who use different cognitive maps, like one, say, uses the island and one uses the trade association, then they have to translate. And so the government's interested in a uniform system of recording these transactions, and also it's a way of undercutting the power of families and other people in the city. Because if you take out the language of this is their neighborhood, there's a book about this in Marseille, about how this shift occurs in Marseille, called Imaginary Cartographies by a medievalist called Daniel Lord Smale. That's quite good, and he describes some of this process at work.